Hello, this is Monica Bashir.
And this is Emma Rosenberg, and today we will be your co-hosts of Codename Verity Extra Credit Opportunity.
In Codename Verity by Elizabeth Wayne, the two main characters, Julia and Maddie, undergo different types of training in attempt to put an end to World War II.
Both characters, throughout the war, refute the traditional concept that women are unfit to serve their country.
Due to certain circumstances, they go on to pursue different roles in the war.
Violette Szabo, a member of the SOE, or Special Operations Executives, relate to Julia Lindsay Mackenzie Wallace Buford Stewart, in that they both suffered through the throes of torture as well as witnessing their fellow comrades be slaughtered by their Nazi captors.
Very interesting insight, Emma.
Why, thank you, Monica.
Also, Betty Lussier's life closely resembles that of Maddie Brodat's in that they both had private pilot's licenses and learned how to fly at an early age.
Alright, let's get started.
Great!
Violette Szabo, the daughter of an English father and a French mother, spent her early years in France, but moved to England at age 12.
Sadly, after her husband's tragic death, she decided to join the Special Operations Executive in order to make a contribution in her country's fight against the Axis powers.
Just as Julia did, right, Monica?
Yes, they were both women contributing to their country's war efforts.
Did you know that Szabo received a Bravery Medal of Honor and the George Cross, the UK's second highest military honor, by defying traditional patriarchy and maintaining a level of courage throughout the war?
Just as Julia was courageous
in many different ways. For instance, when Julia Lindsay Mackenzie Wallace Buford Stewart helped her friends Maddie Brodat overcome her various fears.
Very captivating, Emma.
Thank you, Monica.
So what we are trying to emphasize to our listeners is the astonishing similarities between the two.
Indeed.
Indeed.
Well put.
Thank you.
Another similarity between Julia Lindsay Mackenzie Wallace Buford Stewart and Szabo is that they both had code names.
Indeed they did. Julia Lindsay Mackenzie Wallace Buford Stewart's code name was Verity,
while Szabo's was Corinne.
How fascinating. Also, they both spoke French.
Yes, and that came in handy in their line of work.
How so?
Well, Julia Lindsay Mackenzie Wallace Buford Stewart and Szabo were in the SOE, or Special Operations Executives, which reconciled with French resistant workers.
You don't say.
So knowing French was significant, right?
Yes, because the Special Operations Executives strategically sent agents behind enemy lines.
Like France?
Yes.
France was occupied by Germany.
So, knowing German must have been helpful too.
Quite so. And I'm glad that you brought that up. Julia Lindsay Mackenzie Wallace Buford Stewart spoke German.
Yes. And when foolish Nazis were talking about Julia Lindsay Mackenzie Wallace Buford Stewart in German, she was able to overhear
their plan for her. Her plan to be sent into the NNN.
Night and Fog.
Or
Nacht und Nebel.
In German.
Julia Lindsay Mackenzie Wallace Buford Stewart came to the conclusion that meant that she was going to be sent to a concentration camp.
How tragic! And similar to Szabo, they both were sentenced to concentration camps.
And they both had to watch those they knew die as part of a cruel and inhumane method of torture used by the Nazis. The Nazis had a way of using both physical and psychological torture in such a brutish and vicious way. What they did to their captors is looked back on as one of the most appalling parts of history. In order to remain poised, professional, and on topic throughout this podcast, let's get some facts from the Fact Forecast from Monica Bashir. Over to you, Monica.
Thanks, Emma. It's a pleasure being here today. On one of her missions, Szabo was captured and handed over to the Gestapo in Paris and was interrogated.
This instance is similar to how Julia Lindsay Mackenzie Wallace Buford Stewart was captured by the Nazis. One of her captors went by the name of von Linden.
According to the Smithsonian, after being captured and interrogated, Szabo was sentenced to a concentration camp. Conditions there were very harsh, and people were constantly getting sick. Her and Denise Bloch and Lillian Rolfe did harsh labor clearing boulders for airfields and were subject to beatings.
This is reflective of what the Nazis would do to Julia Lindsay Mackenzie Wallace Buford Stewart if they continue with her night and fog fate.
How very reflective, Emma.
Thank you.
Bloch and Rolfe, the wireless operators that Szabo consorted with, were given the death sentence, and as a form of torture, Szabo was forced to watch them die before she was killed.
Likewise, in codename Verity, Julia Lindsay Mackenzie Wallace Buford Stewart had to watch a French girl die. And although they had very different conditions of imprisonment and did not know each other for very long, they seemed to have a strong emotional connection when Julia Lindsay Mackenzie Wallace Buford Stewart had to watch this French girl named Marie die on her behalf. Now, as the very professional people that Monica and I are, we are going to take this time to regale you with the following words of wisdom.
Although this assignment perturbs us both,
we will feign a feeling of alacrity
and beguile you with this ardent and salient intermission with gravitas, as you and we take this time from this banal and tedious podcast to focus on those lost in World War II. Thank you for your cooperation.
Now, let's shift over to what we know so far about Officer Maddie Brodat.
Yes, Maddie's life closely resembles that of Betty Lussier.
How so?
Well, they both were pilots.
And they both felt as though their role in serving their country was restricted.
Maddie and Lussier both served in the ATA or Air Transport Auxiliary as well.
How interesting.
The Air Transport Auxiliary was created in the beginning of World War II in order for pilots who were unfit for the front line to be put to use. These air pilots were called unfit for the front lines because of age, gender, or disability. What other similarities do they share?
Well, they both had an astounding amount of confidence in themselves throughout the war and used their sense of direction to their advantage.
Lussier also had the opportunity to fly to various places around the world, like Officer Maddie Brodat.
Maddie learned how to fly from a friend by the name of Dimpna Withenshaw, as Betty Lussier learned how to fly through a family friend. Because Officer Lussier and Officer Brodat are both women, they had the chance to prove themselves in a male-dominant society.
Emma, do you think Elizabeth Wayne could have been inspired by Violette Szabo and Betty Lussier to form the characters Julia Lindsay Mackenzie Wallace Buford Stewart and Maddie?
Yes, I do, Monica, and I'll tell you why. In an interview with Elizabeth Wayne, she was asked whether the characters Julia Lindsay Mackenzie Wallace Buford Stewart and Maddie were inspired by any outside historic people, and her answer was the following. Well, good question. The things they do were inspired by real people. I read a lot about the Special Operations Executive and the Air Transport Auxiliary when I was doing research for codename Verity, and I made alter use of some of their experiences.
How intriguing! Based off this, we can infer that Elizabeth Wayne used Violette Szabo and Betty Lussier to inspire the characters Julia Lindsay Mackenzie, Wallace Buford Stewart, and Maddie Brodat.
Now time for our outro. Not intro, but outro.
Now, let's recap the ways Violette Szabo reflects Julia Lindsay Mackenzie Wallace Buford Stewart.
Well, Violette Szabo and Julia Lindsay Mackenzie Wallace Buford Stewart were both a part of the SOE, or Special Operations Executive. They both underwent torture as a part of their commitment to serving their country, and they both had to suffer through the agony of watching one of the people that they knew die by the Nazi captors.
Also, Betty Lussier is similar to Maddie Brodat because they both have pilot's licenses and learned how to fly.
One thing that these four women have in common is their attempt to contradict the patriarchal forces in society during their time.
Thank you, Emma.
You're welcome, Monica. Is there anything else you'd like to add on to that conclusion?
Yes, by serving alongside their male counterparts, these women managed to prove their place in society was not only in the home.
What seems like minor contributions eventually led to a crux where women were no longer perceived as lesser of men, but as equal or near equal.
Other than helping the war efforts, how could women be perceived as equal to men?
Good question, Monica. Now to answer your question. Women were needed to fill many traditional male jobs while the men were at war. But it was the aviation industry that saw the greatest increase in female workers during World War II. There was a diverse amount of women in age in the SOE, meaning that women were just finishing high school, or women had children and were mothers, to working class women and aristocrats. As well, if you spoke fluent French and you were trained as a wireless operator, as Julia was in codename Verity, then your skill was essential and irresistible to the SOE. In fact, most women of the SOE worked as wireless operators, which was a very dangerous role, meaning that several women were captured, tortured, and killed by Germans. They worked alongside their male counterparts, learning spycraft, learning how to use weapons and unarmed combat, and as well parachute training. They tested British gender boundaries and were part of a great change in their society, serving in many branches of armed forces, and worked like men alongside men with the same courage. Now to switch over to the ATA, in which Maddie and codename Verity was a part of. The ATA pilots were either too old or too unfit for active service. The first women to join the ATA were restricted to only flying non-operational types of planes and were paid 20% less than the men were. This further reveals the mindset during this time period and the concept that men were superior to women. Now, later on in 1941, women eventually gained their equal flying rights and eventually earned equal pay to their male counterparts in 1943, which made the ATA one of the first equal opportunities employers. This was significant change to the mindset that women were lesser than men. In conclusion, Violette Szabo resembles the life of Julia Lindsay Mackenzie Wallace Buford Stewart in codename Verity in that they both served as part of the SOE, and they both... In conclusion, Violette Szabo's life closely resembles Julia's from Codename Verity, and Betty Lussier's life closely resembles that of Maddie's. Thank you for taking this time to listen to our podcast, and we hope that you enjoyed it.